Yo, what is going on, you guys? Today we're going to be looking at the Shadow Necromancer build that is extremely amazing. It's probably one of the most powerful builds I've seen in the entire game. The Shadow Necromancer build can currently do dot damage up to 2 billion or 3 billion DPS per second and kill Tormented Duriel in under 20 seconds, even up to 10 seconds with how much damage this build is doing. It's also extremely survivable, so you can easily beat tier 100, 110, even tier 120 pit dungeons very easily with not too much of a struggle, given the high scaling damage of this actual build, as well as the tankiness and survivability. You can do every single piece of content in the game with absolute ease, not to mention hit 700 million DOT damage and also again up to that 2 billion mark, which is insane. Now we're going to jump into the skills, but really quick, make sure to check out the link down in the description for the original build. Also go below and check out C-Rock's YouTube channel as well, and the official build planner on Wowhead, as well as the other build planner on Mobalytics. So our first basic skill, we're going to be taking Reap. We have to take this to move on down to the next part of the skill tree, but we're not going to use it. And then we'll take the next 2 ranks of Blight that will make it so that Blight's defiled area slows enemies by 25%, and you and your minions deal extra damage. Then we're going to also make sure we take 3 out of 3 for the Hued Flesh passive, so on lucky hit your damage has up to a 12% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. This is going to be very beneficial for our corpse tendrils and other things, but also we want 3 out of 3 for the imperfectly balanced passive as well, so your core skills cost 9% more essence, but you deal 15% more damage. Next we want to take Blood Mist. This is going to be our survivability skill. This is going to allow us to turn into a Blood Mist, and when going into the next 2 ranks, it makes casting a skill that overpowers, reduces the cooldown of Blood Mist by 2 seconds, and Blood Mist also leaves behind a corpse every 1 second. And this is our get out of jail free card, so nobody can do damage because we are immune for 3 seconds. And again, we're going to take that into Ghastly Blood Mist. Next, we want to take Corpse Explosion here. This is going to be a big damage attack for us, so we deal that shadow dot damage over 6 seconds for a ton of damage on lucky hit. Then once we scale this into Blighted Corpse Explosion, it's going to make it so our Corpse Explosion becomes a darkness skill, making it huge hits for that shadow dot damage. And with the middle rank, you also get Corpse Explosion radius increased by 15%. Next, we're going to take 1 out of 3 here for Grim Harvest into Fueled by Death, so we deal 9% increased damage for 6 seconds after consuming a corpse, allowing us to again upscale our damage even more for this build. Then we're going to come down here and take Death's Embrace for 3 out of 3. The Death's Embrace passive makes it that close enemies take 6% more damage and deal 12% less damage to you, so it's a good damage and DR skill as well. And then we also want Death's Approach for 3 out of 3, so we get that 12% movement speed. We also want to take 3 out of 3 for Amplified Damage. This passive gives us 12% increased damage to cursed enemies. And finally, we want Decrepify, so that way we can cast this on enemies, slow them, and allow them to deal less damage to us, which makes it a great DR ability or defensive ability, not even to mention the damage. And then the other modifier, so on lucky hit, while enemies are afflicted with Decrepify, they have up to a 10% chance to be stunned, which allows us to proc more damage on stunned enemies. And also on lucky hit, enemies have up to a 15% chance to reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second, making this one of our best skills because it allows us to reduce all of our cooldowns, sometimes almost instantaneously, as long as we're casting Decrepify and afflicting enough enemies with that curse. Next, we're going to come down here and take a couple passives. We're going to take Reaper's Pursuit 1 out of 3, and then we want to take Gloom 3 out of 3. So when you damage an enemy with darkness skills, they take 6% increased shadow damage from you and your minions for 2 seconds, and this can stack up to 3 times, giving us up to 18% additional shadow damage for our big hit skills. We also want 3 out of 3 for Terror, so that we do a 9% increased shadow damage to enemies who are slowed or chilled, and 9% increased shadow damage to enemies who are again stunned, immobilized, or frozen, allowing us to double dip on our damage a little bit. And finally, we want 1 out of 3 for Crippling Darkness as well. Then we also want to take Corpse Tendrils. Also, when you take the other modifiers here for Corpse Tendrils, enemies who are in range of Corpse Tendrils are slowed by 15% before being pulled, again allowing us to meet that slow requirement. And it also makes it so that enemies we damage with Corpse Tendrils makes them vulnerable, making them take even more immense amounts of damage. Again, we scale into Plagued Corpse Tendrils for that. Now also we want 3 out of 3 for the Necrotic Carapace passive, so when a corpse is formed from your skills or your minions, Fortify for 6% of your max life, allowing us to stack Fortify very consistently and keep that buff up no matter what, giving us that max DR. We also want to come down here and take the standalone passive, so we increase our damage reduction by 18% with no minions, which is perfect because that's exactly what this build is. And each active minion reduces that bonus by 2, allowing us to keep 18% DR up all of the time. And then also Memento Mori. Then we finally want Bone Storm, and your damage reduction is increased by 15% while it's active. And then finally we want the Shadow Blight key passive. So while we're constantly inflicting enemies with shadow damage, it's keying up to infect them with Shadow Blight. And every 10th time an enemy receives that shadow damage from you or your minions, they take additional shadow damage, and our shadow damage is increased by 100% of your shadow damage over time bonus. Again, all of these shadow dot damage abilities and skills all stack up to, again, eventually create that 2 billion damage mark or 3 billion damage mark that you can hit enemies or bosses with once you stack enough on them. Next, we want to take a look at some of the gear. So we're going to go over the aspects first. Firstly, the best helmet you can use is Harlequin Crest. In the build planner, I'll have a replacement for this, but you want the Harlequin Crest, giving us again that big 20% damage reduction buff and gaining us +4 ranks to all of our skills. Then we want aspect of Hardened Bones. So you and your minions gain 25% increased damage reduction right off the bat. We also want aspect of the Damned. So you deal 50% increased shadow damage to enemies afflicted by any curse. Next, for our pants, we want the aspect of Shielding Storm. So each time the Bone Storm damages an enemy, we get barrier equal to 6% of your base life for 10 seconds. And then for our boots, we'll take aspect of Concussive Strikes. So that way, on lucky hit, damaging an enemy has up to a 20% chance to daze them for 2 seconds. And we deal 20% increased damage to dazed enemies. Then for our two-handed scythe, we're going to use the blighted aspect. So you do a 240% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemy 10 times and procs. This is a huge damage aspect for us. Now for our rings, we went with the aspect of Inner Calm on one ring. So we do a 10% increased damage across the board and triple that damage when we stand still, up to again 30% additional damage buff. The next ring, we want the aspect of Retribution so that distant enemies have a chance to be stunned when they hit you, and we deal 30% increased damage to stunned or knocked down enemies. And then for our amulet, we're going to take the Ebon Piercer unique. This is going to give us a couple different things: shadow damage over time buffs, damage reduction from shadow damage over time affected enemies, which will proc on every enemy almost non-stop, huge essence cost reduction, and also a skill that Blight also shoots 4 smaller projectiles that pierce enemies and deal shadow damage over time for 3 seconds. Again, combining this with all our skills allow us to stack the most amount of shadow damage over time on our enemies and again achieve those insane damage numbers. Now I'll go over the stats really quick. So obviously we have Harlequin's Crest. The main thing you want to focus on is trying your best to get cooldown reduction when masterworking. Then for our chest, we want Intelligence, Max Life, and Essence per second. For our chest, we also want to temper Max Life and Corpse Tendril size, allowing us to grab many more enemies with Corpse Tendrils. Then for our gloves, we want Intelligence, attack speed, and damage over time. Again, damage over time being important for our damage, and attack speed if you can get this as a greater affix, especially masterworked. Again, the more attack speed we have, the higher amount of damage. And then for our gloves, we want to temper overall damage and the lucky hit temper for up to a 21% chance to immobilize enemies for 2 seconds. And then for our pants, we want Intelligence, Max Life, and Armor. And then for our pants, we want to temper Max Life and up to a 28.9% chance to stun for 2 seconds. Again, we're taking all of these stun and immobilize lucky hit chances so we can again stun and immobilize and hit all of these enemies with all these different abilities. Next, for our boots, we want Intelligence. Again, Essence per second is a big one, and movement speed to allow us to move much quicker, up to 36.3% chance to slow for 2 seconds, and movement speed tempered on the boots. Now for our two-handed scythe, we want Intelligence, damage over time, and overall damage percentage, as well as tempered overall damage again, and upping our Bone Storm duration so we can get up to 72.5% additional Bone Storm duration. And then for our ring, again, we want Intelligence, attack speed as a greater affix that's also masterworked, and damage over time for our regular affixes. And our tempered ones, we want darkness damage and resource generations. And then for the other ring, again, pretty much the same thing. You want Intelligence, Max Life, and attack speed. Again, attack speed as a greater affix, and also masterworked as our primary ability to give us more output for our damage, and the shadow damage over time tempered on this item, as well as resource generation again. Again, we want the Ebon Piercer unique amulet, but again, we get that huge damage reduction buff, as well as essence cost reduction and the additional shadow damage over time, and nice to have movement speed. Now for the Book of the Dead, for our skeletal warriors, we're going to take the third option for Reaper. So you deal 15% increased shadow damage, but you can no longer rage skeletal warriors. For our skeletal mages, we want the cold third option, giving us 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, but again, no longer able to raise skeletal mages, again buffing our damage pretty high. And for Golem, we want the third bone option, so you gain 10% increased attack speed, but again lose the ability to summon, but this is all buffing our damage in a big way. And then for our Paragon board here, for the first starter board, we're going to want to take the Gravekeeper glyph. This is going to grant us bonus to all of our rare nodes within that range, and also deal 2% increased damage up to 12% for every close corpse, which can scale very high once we get a lot of corpses. We also want to take, again, these rare nodes for max life and damage percentage. And we also want to take this other one over here for max life and resistance to all elements. This other one up here for armor and intelligence, as well as additional armor, helps us to hit our armor cap very early. Next, we're going to take the Wither board and node. This is going to give us basically a ton of additional damage. I'll let you read all that, but basically this is going to give us a 51% chance with the way this is currently set up to have a 234% extra amount of bonus damage. But we also want to have socketed here the Amplify glyph to grant us 150% bonus to all the nodes, again, within that range. And when meeting the requirements, our additional bonus makes it so enemies affected by curse skills take 10% increased damage from you and your minions, again buffing our damage even more. And the rare node here, again, giving us additional shadow damage and intelligence, which we meet very easily. And then some of these other ones, so additional shadow damage over time and shadow damage reduction from shadow damage over time affected enemies and shadow resistance, and again, potion healing and max life. And all of these, since it's our second board, we meet these requirements very easily. Next, the Sin of Death board. So with at least 2 corpses nearby, you gain 15% DR, and with no corpses nearby, you get increased damage. So either way, you're getting a huge buff, especially when there's a corpse. And then we want to take the Sacrificial glyph here. So again, you get that bonus to all magic nodes in that area, and 10% increased damage while you have no active minions, which means that is a damage buff that's up all the time with this build. We also want to make sure we take the rare nodes again here for damage to injured enemies and additional intelligence, and the max life nodes up here with additional shadow resistance. Then we'll come up and take the Bone Graft board, and we're not actually going to take that legendary node, but we want to make sure we take the max life nodes here. This is going to be big for our overall HP. And we also want to socket the Abyssal glyph, so that way our Paragon nodes within range get plus 75% bonus to their non-physical damage and damage reduction modifiers. And also, if you meet the additional requirements, you and your minions deal 10% increased non-physical damage, again buffing our shadow over time damage. And then next, we want to come over here and take the Bloodbath board. When we're not taking the actual legendary node itself, we want to socket the Control glyph. So for every 5 intelligence purchased within the range, you deal a large amount of extra damage to crowd control targets. You also get, so you and your minions, when meeting the bonus, to deal 20% increased damage to crowd controlled enemies. We also want to take Thick Hide for additional damage while fortified at max life, as well as the other node. We then want to take the Flesh Eater passive. This is one of the things we're going to proc very consistently. So consuming 5 corpses grants us 40% increased damage for 6 seconds. And you basically need to proc this by, again, consuming those 5 corpses consistently to keep this 40% increased damage buff up constantly. We want to slot the Scourge glyph here. So again, for each 5 intelligence, we increase our shadow damage over time, and you and your minions deal 10% increased damage to enemies affected by a shadow damage over time effects, giving us, again, that increased bump to our damage as well as resistance. And then the final Paragon board is the Hulking Monstrosity board, and the glyph we want to slot here is the Exploit glyph. So that way, for 5 dexterity purchased within the range, you deal additional damage to vulnerable targets, and dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases your damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to, again, a maximum additional damage there of 10% overall, which we can keep up fairly well. And we'd want to take this rare node for mutation, giving us some intelligence as well. Again, make sure to check out the build link in the description, as well as Sekro's YouTube channel, and go over there and send him a big shout out for this build, because he really put this thing together, and it's actually really masterful, and again, can deal massive damage, even more than I've seen on every character that I've built so far.